Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm really excited to share with you the details of how Aurora Solar's powerful software models irradiance for the ultimate purpose of accurately estimating energy production of solar PV systems designed in our platform. Bit more background about myself. I recently joined Aurora Solar to manage our enterprise level customers, and that means advanced users who need a powerful, accurate, and flexible design and sales software solution that also integrates seamlessly in their processes and their own software platforms. Over half my career has been in solar energy, managing both hardware and software solutions, which range from residential to large scale commercial and utility applications. My background is in electrical engineering, with the first half of my career working in software, and I've also gained strong business acumen from studying at one of the top international business schools and applying this knowledge to the complex world of solar financing. Now, a little background on Aura. I imagine we have some people on today's call who are familiar with Aurora Solar or are not current customers. But for those who are not, Aura is a solar design and sales software program that helps solar contractors design and sell better solar. We're based in San Francisco, California, and our software is designed from the ground up to help solar installers, designers, and other professionals in the industry solve a few key problems in the sales and design process. Our goal is to easily help our customers precisely construct a model to place PV panels in 3D space and estimate the amount of energy that the PV system can produce based on a number of variables such as shading and electrical characteristics of the system. We've also built a powerful engine that calculates financial savings based on the energy offset by the designed solar system and a wide range of financial products, incentives, and utility rates. Over 60,000 projects are designed in our platform every month, and we're trusted by hundreds of successful solar companies across the world, some of which you might recognize by their logos at the bottom of this slide. And although we work with some of the very largest companies in the industry, we also work with a lot of small to mid-sized businesses, both here in the United States and abroad. Now let's focus on the subject at hand today, irradiance modeling. Now, while solar software makes it easy to calculate irradiance with a click of a button, having a true understanding of how irradiance is calculated can help you better answer customer questions and ensure that you're using the best tools to provide accurate irradiance and production estimates. In today's presentation, we'll provide an in-depth look at irradiance and related concepts. First, we'll go over a brief definition of the terms and metrics around the topic of irradiance that are utilized in the solar industry. Then we'll cover the various components of irradiance and evaluating the impact of shading on a roof plane and solar systems. We'll then have a few live demonstrations of how the irradiance model in Aurora works, and finally discuss what Aurora has done to dramatically increase the speed of irradiance calculations. Before we get into a deeper discussion of how irradiance is calculated, let's review in part 1 how irradiance is defined, as well as a few related solar terms that are commonly used in the industry. There are several common metrics for communicating how much solar energy is available at a particular location, including irradiance, insolation, tilt and orientation factor, or TOF, total solar resource fraction, or TSRF. Before we get into how irradiance is calculated and some of the tools that solar contractors can use to ensure accurate irradiance and perform simulations, let's be clear on what each of these terms means and how they're related. Now first, irradiance and insolation are perhaps two of the most important terms to know for describing the available solar energy at a project site. The two terms are often used interchangeably in practice within the solar industry, as both quantify the amount of solar radiation a surface receives, but they measure that value in different ways. Irradiance is a measure of solar power, whereas insolation is a measure of solar energy. So irradiance quantifies the amount of solar power that arrives in a particular area at any given moment, and is usually expressed in watts per meter square or kilowatts per meter square. When that value is converted to express the total amount of energy that an area receives over a certain amount of time, say 1 hour, it is communicated in watt hours, or depending on the quantity, kilowatt hours per unit area. So for example, kilowatt hours per meter square. This is a measure of solar irradiation or insolation. Now, while the technical terms for irradiance and insolation are distinct to refer to power or energy respectively, the solar industry tends to only use irradiance to describe sun energy per surface area instead of insolation or irradiation. You'll note that in Aurora, we also use the term irradiance instead of irradiation or insolation, and we communicated that value in kilowatt hours per meter squared over the course of a year. This provides a helpful way of conceiving the amount of solar energy that will be available to your solar installation over the course of the year, given any shade that is present as well as the local weather patterns. This also is visually represented as an irradiance map in Aura, as you can see here on this slide, where the darker colors represent areas where there is less irradiance than the lighter colored areas. All right, so let's talk about solar access percentage. So solar access is another term used to quantify how much sunlight is available for a solar array at a particular site. It is also referred to as SAP, solar access percentage, or solar access value. This metric expresses the available solar energy as a percentage of what would be available in perfect, for example, shade-free conditions. Solar access is calculated by dividing the actual solar energy present given shading at the site by the incident solar energy if there was no shade. This is a handy metric as it provides an easy way to understand how significant shade is reducing the available solar energy. Now, TOF, or tilt orientation factor, is a metric that takes into account how the slope and the direction of a given surface impacts the solar energy that the surface receives. The specific tilt and orientation that maximizes the solar energy reaching a surface varies depending on latitude. Like solar axis, TOF is a percentage that expresses actual conditions compared to optimal conditions. TOF is calculated by dividing the solar energy available at the actual tilt and orientation of the surface by what would be available at the optimal tilt and orientation. All right, another very useful and popular solar metric is TSRF. Total Solar Resource Fraction, or TSRF, is a measure of available solar energy that takes into account the two other metrics we've just discussed, solar axis, or SAP, and TOF, or tilt orientation factor. TSRF can be calculated by multiplying the solar axis of the site by the TOF percentage. TSRF provides a more complete picture of how solar energy will be available for the solar panels to convert into electricity. This is because it takes into account both the percentage of available solar energy at a given shading, solar axis, and how much of that energy will reach the surface where the solar panel will be mounted given its tilt and orientation, TOF. Of course, there are other factors like the stringing configuration and the capabilities of the components that you use, which will significantly impact the amount of energy your solar design will produce ultimately given the sunlight it receives. But we'll do a quick review of how shading impacts energy production later in the presentation. For now, accurately quantifying the solar energy that is available to the PV system is an essential first step in correctly estimating the system's energy output. And these are some common terms that are important to differentiate. Okay, let's now move on to the second part of our webinar. While solar irradiance is commonly thought as being just based on the rays of sunlight that directly reach a surface, there are actually several sources of irradiance that go into the calculation. Let's take a quick look at each of these sources. There are actually three components that comprise irradiance. The first of these is that direct beam irradiance that you might intuitively associate with irradiance. It involves determining whether there are any objects that would block rays of the sun from reaching the solar panel directly, i.e. Shading, in order to determine if this component should be included in the total irradiance or not. Now, in addition to this, there are two types of diffuse or indirect irradiance that need to be accounted for. Sky diffuse irradiance, which is the light reflected from the atmosphere, separate from direct rays of sunlight that fall on the panel, and ground reflected diffuse irradiance, which is light that is reflected back up from the ground surface. Of the three types of irradiance, direct beam irradiance calculations require the most processing power for software to calculate. This is because shading from surrounding objects must be calculated based on the location of the sun at every daylight hour of the year, and these calculations can quickly add up, as you can imagine. In order to determine whether the rays of the sun will directly hit a particular surface, one must first have an accurate understanding of the surroundings, including objects like trees, surrounding buildings and roof lanes, obstructions such as skylight, vents, and chimneys. This is why the starting point of creating a solar design in Aurora is to construct a 3D model of the project site. Aurora's Irradiance engine then translates the fully modeled project into a simpler shape, which are more conducive to computational processes by computers. Now, the process we discussed earlier of calculating the direct beam irradiance based on whether rays of the sun will reach a certain point is the most computationally intensive aspect of irradiance calculation, and is where Aurora pioneered significant improvements in speed for complex project sites. Because a project site can contain thousands of objects and intersections with solar rays have to be calculated for every daylight hour of the year, the number of calculations that need to be computed can be significant. There are generally over 5,000 daylight hours for a given location. This means that for each point on the roof, over 5,000 potential sun locations must be simulated, and a complex project site would require irradiance calculations for as many as 100 to 500,000 points. As you can imagine then, running these processes one at a time could sometimes be a very lengthy process, especially for very large or complicated sites. Now, in addition to direct beam irradiance, there are two types of diffuse or indirect irradiance that need to be accounted for. Sky diffuse irradiance, the light reflected from the atmosphere, again separate from the direct rays of sunlight that fall on the panel, and ground reflected diffuse irradiance, the light that is reflected back up from the ground. You can see here in these two examples, on the left you have a sky diffuse irradiance whereby clouds might be reflecting more sunlight than if there were no clouds, and on the right with the snow on the surface reflecting more light than if it was a darker surface. Finally, in order to calculate these three broad types of irradiance, it's also necessary to take into account the angle of the array and the direction to the sun relative to the panels. So to recap, these are the three components of solar irradiance: beam irradiance, sky diffuse irradiance, and ground diffuse irradiance. Aurora compiles all of these calculations when generating an irradiance map, like this one that visually shows how the irradiance levels vary across different points on the roof. Again, lighter colors indicate higher irradiance. You can see here that around each of the obstructions, like the vent pipes, for example, and along the roof, there's also less irradiance because the obstructions are casting shade. You can also see that certain roof faces have lower irradiance because they have less optimal tilt and orientation. Alright, now that we've discussed how irradiance is defined and calculated, it's important to understand how irradiance impacts solar energy production. Intuition suggests that power output of the panel will be reduced proportionally to the area that is shaded. However, this is not the case at all. The reduction in power output from even a small amount of shade can be significant. Let's review why shade has such a disproportionate impact. So to conceptualize why shading results in such severe can cause such severe losses, it's helpful to use the analogy of water flowing through a pipe. The flow rate of water through a pipe is constant, much like the current through a string of panels is constant for a given irradiance level. In string inverter systems, shading a solar panel is similar to introducing a clog in the pipe of water. The clog in the pipe restricts the flow of water through the entire pipe. Similarly, when a solar panel is shaded, the current through the entire string is reduced. This is significant because every panel in the string has to operate at the current set by the shaded panel. This prevents the unshaded panel from operating at their maximum power. Therefore, only a small amount of shading can have a dramatic effect on the power output of a solar panel. The same principle applies to solar cells connected in cell strings within a solar panel. The current flowing through an entire cell can be heavily reduced if even for just a single cell is shaded, leading to potentially significant loss of power output. So for this reason, manufacturers incorporate bypass diodes in their panels. Bypass diodes are devices within a solar panel that allow the current to skip over shaded regions of the module. So by utilizing bypass diodes, the higher current of the unshaded cell strings can flow around the shaded cell string. However, this comes at the expense of losing the output of the cells that are skipped over, obviously. Although it would be theoretically ideal to have a bypass diode for each single solar cell, for cost reasons, a typical solar panel will have 3 bypass diodes, effectively grouping the cells into 3 series cell strings. For instance, a 60 cell module will typically have one bypass diode for every 20 cells. Many tools for modeling energy production fail to take into account electrical behavior within the modules themselves, and that's something I will discuss more in one of the upcoming demos that discusses submodule simulations. Speaking of which, let's now explore a few software features that give solar contractors improved ability to accurately model irradiance and energy production. I'm going to demonstrate 3 tools in Aurora Solar that can be super valuable. 1, how showing the irradiance directly on the modules can help make good design decisions. 2, how cell string level performance simulations are more accurate when taking a module's configuration of bypass diodes and cell stringing into account. And 3, adding horizon shading to the equation of shade impact on energy performance. In our first demo, we're going to take a look at a feature that Aurora recently added, which is the ability to see an irradiance map or indications of irradiance levels on the surface of the solar panels themselves, rather than just on the roof surface that you're designing on. There are a number of situations where being able to see this can be very, very helpful, such as a commercial system where the rows of modules cast shade on each other, such as what you see here in this moving image. With this functionality, you can get a visual cue that this is what's happening, something you wouldn't easily be able to see within the irradiance map that is only on the roof. So let's take a look at the tool in action now. Please give me a quick moment here while I switch over to the Aura app. Alright, I'm now logged into the Aura software, and I'm looking at a large-scale commercial rooftop system. And some of you might remember this design from my previous webinar on large-scale commercial designs. So if I zoom in to the right side where I have a single tilt system, I could see here that I have some pretty tight rows of single tilt panels at about 10 degrees tilt with a few obstructions. So if I go ahead and load my irradiance map, you can see that the irradiance map first loads on the roof, and then the irradiance map on the panels will be loaded as well and calculated as a second step. And as you zoom in to the different rows, you can see that there's darker areas at the bottom of each panel, which you wouldn't have seen otherwise. And this is very useful because it could tell you that the actual shading on the bottom part of each of these rows is causing some impact, and you can actually load up the graphs on each of these panels. And as you get closer to the bottom edge, you can see that the solar axis or SAP values are dropping pretty significantly in the winter months between November and February here. And as I move away, it goes back to 100%. I can also load the irradiance chart, and it shows how the irradiance drops as well, going from the top to the bottom of the module. So that gives me a good idea that these modules are going to be pretty heavily shaded, and you might lose some energy production. So it might be better off to go ahead and change your system design here under the options, where I would increase my row spacing from, let's say, 4 inches to 20 inches. And as I update the panels, this can be done live in 3D, and it will rerun the entire system and reload all the panels. Now, because I've reloaded the panels, the radiance map on the panel has changed, and I would have to rerun my radiance at the top here to reload it. And there it is. And now that we have increased our row spacing, you can see that there's a lot less shading at the bottom of these rows. As a matter of fact, if I open up my solar axis and as I hover over the panel, I barely see a drop of maybe 1 or 2 percentage points from the 100% where it would be unshaded at the top of the panel. So again, that's a very, very useful way to visualize the irradiance on the panels themselves and evaluate the impact of shading on the system as well when you run your energy production. By the way, one thing I wanted to make sure to highlight is that even before this visual change was added, Aurora was already taking into account the irradiance on the surface of the modules in our performance simulations. The update we recently made was just to represent this shading impact on the panels directly, so as to help our customers visually recognize irradiance variances before even running energy simulations. Okay, the next powerful tool that we're going to highlight provides a means of getting a more accurate estimate of solar energy production in cases where only parts of the modules are shaded. As I discussed earlier, shade on one module in a string of panels in series reduces the current of the entire strings like a clog in a pipe, and that same process applies to solar cells connected within a single module. However, as we also discussed, manufacturers integrate bypass diodes within the modules so that shaded sections can be bypassed and not bring down the output of the entire module. Most modern panels include more than one diode in a module, effectively dividing the module up into smaller sections called cell strings, each with a parallel bypass diode. Now, when there's shade only on one of these cell strings, it can be bypassed while the rest of the module operates at a maximum power. For modules with 3 cell strings, for example, and 3 bypass diodes, that means we only lose about a third of the module's power instead of the entire module's power when one the cell string receives shade. However, many simulation programs that estimate the energy production of a solar design fail to take into account an accurate secret model of what's going on within each module. Aurora was the first solar software to pioneer modeling energy production down to the cell string level, what we like to call sub-module simulation. Modeling solar designs to this level of granularity can have an appreciable impact on energy production results and therefore expected financial returns. So now let's take a look at how this works. Let me switch back to the Aura app again. Alright, I'm back in the Aura app and I have the same exact house and system that was shown in the previous slide. Whereby this house has several southwest facing roofs which have the most energy because they are showing more yellow and brighter colors on the irradiance map. And I also happen to have a fairly tall but narrow tree here, kind of a cypress tree, that will definitely cast some shadow on the solar system as the sun moves through the sky. So I have a 10 panel system with 2 series of 5 connected to an inverter. And in my simulation setting here, I will first run a simulation without the submodule simulation option checked. Alright, and the result of this simulation show that the system will produce 4,226 kilowatt hours per year. So this takes into account the shading as if there were no bypass diodes. Essentially, if a module is shaded, it's going to shade the entire module and not just the part of the cell string. So now let's change the settings and include the submodule simulation checkbox. Click Done, and let's run the simulation again. And the new results show a decent increase of 4,423 kilowatt hours compared to the 4,226 that we previously had, which is about 200 kilowatt hours or 5% more energy production for the system throughout the year. So you can see that with the submodule simulation option checked, we're taking into account the fact that these panels have bypass diodes in a specific cell string configuration, which are beneficial to these kinds of situations where shade is passing by the array throughout the year. Okay, let's now take a look at how the increased energy production can actually affect your financing returns. So to do that, let me first enter some consumption here for that location. I'll pick a sample utility rate and enter some sample energy consumption for a month. The system automatically figures out the rest of the year. And let's go back to our design and look at how the energy offset looks like. So for that simulation, it looks like the higher energy output with the submodule simulation was 4423 kilowatt hours as before, and now we have an 88% energy offset. So let's start by actually turning off energy, the submodule simulation. And let me rerun the simulation here. So we're back at the 4,226 kilowatt hours for the year without the submodule simulation selected, which is an 84% energy offset. Let's go ahead and create some financing template here for a system that would be cash, for example. And to do that, I will run the analysis of that system to analyze the electricity bill post solar and see what the savings would be. So it looks like the monthly bill saving is about $81 per month on average for the year, and the payback period is 5.25 years for a total lifetime saving of $18,000 more or less. And we got some more financial numbers down here, including LCOE of 8.3 cents per kilowatt hour. So now that we have some of those values, let's go ahead and go back to our design, and then we will load our simulation settings again and change it back to include the submodule simulation and rerun our simulation. So again, we're back at the 4,423 kilowatt hours, which is about 2% increase, and our energy offset is more, back up to 88%. And if we go back to our financing now, let's rerun our analysis based on those new energy production numbers. And let's see what that does to our payback period as well as monthly bill savings. So it looks like a monthly bill savings went up to $81.50, so that's $1.50 more saved per month, and our payback period dropped from 5.25 years down to 5 years, and our total lifetime savings increased up to $19,000, so about $1,000 of increase, which is great. Also, the financial metrics are improved, and our LCOE dropped from 8.3 cents per kilowatt hour to 7.7 cents. So that's an example of how just turning on the submodule simulation increases the energy production for that system and yields better financial returns. Okay, let's now move on to our final demo of an exciting feature upcoming to the Aurora platform, horizon shading. If you think back to our discussion of irradiance, and particularly the direct beam component of irradiance, which is determined by calculating whether anything in the project site, like a tree or neighboring building, will block the sun's ray from reaching the solar array. Taking into account just the objects within the project area is typically good enough, but what if you live in a hilly or mountainous area where hills or mountains beyond the immediate project area will block the sun at certain times in the day, like in the early morning or in the late afternoon? Well, that's where horizon shading comes in. In this demo, I'm going to be giving a preview of a new feature that Aurora is going to be releasing very soon, which takes into account the topography around a project site to determine whether mountains or hills will block the direct irradiance. Let's take a look. Okay, I'm now on a development version of Aura's application, as this has not been released to the public yet. And I wanted to show you on a simple house here, which is located in San Francisco, how horizon shading has an impact. So before I do anything with Irradiance, I want to show you the actual location in the city of San Francisco. So let me move over to the maps here. And you may be familiar with the hills in San Francisco. It's famous for having pretty steep hills. And this is the location of the address in a region of the city called Noe Valley. So let me load up the satellite view. And as I zoom in here, you can see that on the west side and the south edge of the house, there are quite a few hills that are fairly steep and that would cast some shadow onto this region of the city in the late afternoon. You can see the ocean in the background, and of course the famous Golden Gate Bridge back there. But as you can see with the hills west and south of this home, that there'll be quite a bit of shade in the winter months especially. So let's move back over to the application. And I'll first load the Irradiance map as it loads by default. And on the west facing roof, it looks like our irradiance is 1700 kilowatt hours per meter square per year. So let's keep that value of 1700 kilowatt hours in mind. And what I'll then go ahead and do here is open up our settings for the design and click on this new horizon shading box. And once I do that, I'll hit apply. And now I'll reload our irradiance map. And as I reload this irradiance map, the horizon shading is now going to be taken into account. And the result is now that this west-facing roof is only 1680 kilowatt hours per meter square per year. So you can see that it actually has dropped by 20 kilowatt hours for the entire year. And that means we lost a bit over 1% of our irradiance due to the fact that the hills on the west and the south side of this location have been taken into account. And that was the last demo of a series of powerful tools that help you accurately model shading and energy performance in Aurora. One final Irradiance advance that I want to share with you today relates to advances that Aurora has made in the speed of software calculations of Irradiance. Let's take a look at this site. This is an example of a very complex site which you wouldn't typically design with that many buildings, but this provides a helpful example of the scale of calculations that can be required at a very large project site such as multi-megawatt commercial projects. Because this process is very computationally intensive, historically computing the irradiance that could actually take a bit of time. That's why Aurora's computation team set about developing an approach to enable Aurora to run many of these computations at the same time. This was done by utilizing graphics processing units, or GPUs, in contrast to central processing units, or CPUs, which you might be familiar with as devices that perform most of the computing processes in your power computer. GPUs rather, are much better at performing thousands of calculation-heavy operations in parallel. So this made it possible to dramatically speed up shading calculations. By computing the intersections of the sun rays with thousands of objects in the scene in parallel, meaning at the same time, rather than sequentially or one after the other, Aurora has been able to deliver 30x speed increases. To put this in context, irradiance for a large commercial project site of 7 megawatts cannot typically be conducted in just under 20 seconds. And of course, this is done while still maintaining the high shading accuracy that Aurora is known and recognized for in the industry. So to sum things up, today we provided an in-depth look at irradiance and several related concepts. First, we define the key terms related to communicate available solar energy at a particular location, such as irradiance, insolation or radiation, solar axis, tilt orientation factor, and total solar resource fraction. We then explored the three components that make up irradiance, which must be calculated to get the most accurate irradiance measurements: direct beam, sky diffuse, and ground diffuse. We also explored why shade has a non-linear impact on energy production due to the way strings of cells and modules are connected together. Next, we highlighted several software advances in the irradiance and performance estimates. Irradiance and modules provide you with visual cues to improve your designs. Simulating performance at the cell string level increases the accuracy of production estimates. And horizon shading provides more accurate results in mountainous areas. And finally, how Aurora achieved 30x improvements in the speed of irradiance calculations. Aura has a lot of other great resources you might be interested in. We encourage you to follow Aura on social media and subscribe to our blog for helpful insights on navigating the solar industry. And Aurora users can also consult our Help Center for videos and answers to common questions. And if you're interested in signing up for Aurora, please feel free to type that in the chat box and someone from Aurora will follow up with you after the demo. So thank you for attending today's webinar.